Scotland and its accent. Scotland is a nation in northwest Europe and one of the constituent countries of the United Kingdom. Scotland is not, however, a sovereign state and doesn't enjoy direct membership of either the United Nations or the European Union. It occupies the northern third of the island of Great Britain and shares a land border to the south with England. It is bounded by the North Sea to the east, the Atlantic Ocean to the north and west, and the Irish Sea to the southwest. Apart from the mainland, Scotland consists of over 790 islands. Scottish waters contain the largest oil reserves in the European Union. The Kingdom of Scotland was an independent state until May 1, 1707, when the Acts of Union resulted in a political union with the Kingdom of England, now England and Wales, to create the Kingdom of Great Britain. Scots law, the Scottish education system, the Church of Scotland and Scottish banknotes have been four cornerstones contributing to the continuation of Scottish culture and Scottish national identity since the Union. Devolution in 1998 brought partial independence from England. Scotland continues the struggle to enjoy true relationships not only with England, but also with an increasingly globalized world community. Etymology. The word Scot was borrowed from Latin, and its use to refer to Scotland dates from at least the first half of the 10th century, when it first appeared in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a reference to the land of the Gaels, analogous to the Latin Scotia. The history of Scotland began in prehistoric times, when modern humans first began to inhabit the land after the end of the last Ice Age. Many artifacts remain from the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age civilizations that existed there. The written history of Scotland began with the arrival of the Romans, who occupied England and Wales, leaving most of modern Scotland as unconquered Caledonia. Scotland was united under Kenneth MacAlpin in 843 and continued as a kingdom throughout the Middle Ages. The Union of the Crowns in 1707 finalized the transition to the United Kingdom and the existence of modern Scotland. Early Scotland. It is believed that the first hunt-gatherers arrived in Scotland around 11,000 years ago, as the ice sheet retreated after the Ice Age. Groups of settlers began building the first permanent houses on Scottish soil around 9,500 years ago, and the first villages around 6,000 years ago. Aside from this period is the well-preserved village of Skara on the mainland of Orkney. Neolithic habitation, burial and ritual sites are particularly common and well preserved in the Northern and Western Isles, where a lack of trees led to most structures being constructed of local stone. The written history of Scotland dates from the arrival of the Roman Empire in southern and central Great Britain, when the Romans occupied what is now England and Wales, administering at it a Roman province called Britannia. To the north was Caledonia, territory not conquered by the Romans. The Roman Emperor Hadrian realized that the Caledonians would refuse to cohabitate with the Romans and that the harsh terrain and highlands made its conquest costly and unprofitable for the empire at large, decided instead to build a wall. Ruins of parts of this wall bearing his name still stand. In the following centuries, the Kingdom of Scotland expanded to something closer to modern Scotland. The period was marked by comparatively good relations with Wessex rulers of England, intense internal dynastic disunity, and relatively successful expansionary policies. Some time after the invasion of King Edmund of England in 945, the province was handed over to King Malcolm I. During the reign of King Indulf, the Scots captured the fortress later called Edinburgh. The reign of Malcolm II saw full incorporation of these territories. The critical year was 1018 when Malcolm II defeated the Northumbrians at the Battle of Carham. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 initiated a chain of events which started to move the Kingdom of Scotland away from its originally Gaelic cultural orientation. Malcolm III married Margaret, the sister of Edgar, the deposed Anglo-Saxon claimant to the throne of England. Margaret played a major role in reducing the influence of Celtic Christianity. Her influence, which stemmed from lifelong dedication to personal piety, was essential to the revivification of Roman Catholicism in Scotland. In fact, that led to her canonization in 1250. When Margaret's younger son, David I, later succeeded, having previously become an important Anglo-Norman lord through marriage, David I introduced feudalism into Scotland and trading links with mainland Europe and Scandinavia. By the late 13th century, scores of Norman and Anglo-Norman families had been granted Scottish lands. The first meetings of the Parliament of Scotland were convened during this period. The death of Alexander III in March 1286, followed by the death of his granddaughter Margaret, Maid of Norway, the last direct heir of Alexander III of Scotland, in 1219 broke the centuries-old succession line of Scotland's kings. This led to the requested arbitration of Edward I, King of England, who would educate between rival claimants to the vacant Scottish throne, a process known as the Great Cause. John Balliol was chosen as a king, having the strongest claim in feudal law. In 1294, Balliol and other Scottish lords refused Edward's demands to serve in his army against the French. Instead, the Scottish Parliament sent envoys to France to negotiate an alliance. Scotland and France signed a treaty on October 23, 1295, known as Old Allies. War ensued and King John was deposed by Edward, who took personal control of Scotland. The Scots resisted in what became known as the Wars of Scottish Independence. So William Wallace and Andrew de Moray emerged as the principal leaders in support of John Balliol, and later Robert the Bruce. Bruce, crowned as King Robert I on March in 1306, won a decisive victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Warfare flared up to his death during the Second War of Scottish Independence, in which Edward Balliol unsuccessfully attempted to win back the throne from Bruce's heirs with the support of the English king. Eventually, with the emergence of the Stuart dynasty in the 1370s, the situation in Scotland began to stabilize. In 1542, James V died, leaving only his infant child Mary as heir to the throne. She was crowned when only 9 months old, becoming Mary, Queen of Scots, and a regent ruled while Mary grew up. This was the time of John Knox and the Scottish Reformation. Intermittent wars with England, political unrest, and religious change dominated the late 16th century, and Mary was finally forced to abdicate the Scottish throne in favor of her son James VI. Modern Scotland. In 1603, when Elizabeth I died, James VI of Scotland inherited the throne of the Kingdom of England, becoming also James I of England. With the exception of a short period under the Protectorate, Scotland remained a separate state, but there was considerable conflict between the Crown and the Covenanters over the form of church government. After the Glorious Revolution and the overthrow of the Roman Catholic James VII by William and Mary, Scotland briefly threatened to select a separate Protestant monarch. In 1707, however, following English threats to end trade and free movement across the border, the Scots Parliament and the Parliament of England enacted the Twin Acts of Union, which created the Kingdom of Great Britain. Two major Jacobite risings launched from the Highlands of Scotland in 1715 and 1745 failed to remove the House of Hanover from the British throne. Because of the geographical orientation of Scotland and its strong reliance on trade routes by sea, the nation held close links in the south and east with the Baltic countries and through Ireland with France and the continent of Europe. Following the Scottish Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, Scotland became one of the commercial, intellectual and industrial powerhouses of Europe, producing philosophers such as Adam Smith and David Hume, and inventors and entrepreneurs such as Alexander Graham Bell, James Watt and Andrew Carnegie. After World War II, Scotland experienced an industrial decline, which was particularly acute. On the latter part of the 20th century, did the country enjoy something of a cultural and economic renaissance. Factors contributing to the recovery included a resurgent financial services and electronics sector, the proceeds of North Sea oil and gas, and the devolved Scottish Parliament, established by the UK government under the Scotland Act 1998. Geography. Scotland comprises the northern third of the island of Great Britain, off the coast of northwestern Europe. The total land mass is around 30,414 square miles. Scotland's only land borders with England running for 60 miles between the River Tweed on the east coast and the Solway Firth in the west. The country consists of a mainland area plus several island groups. The mainland has three areas: the Highlands in the north, the Central Belt and the Southern Uplands in the south. The Highlands are generally mountainous and bisected by the Great Glen, which includes Loch Ness. The highest mountains in the British Isles are found there, including Ben Nevis, the highest peak at 4,409 feet. The Central Belt is generally flat and is where most of the population resides. This area is divided into the West Coast, which contains the areas around Glasgow, and the East Coast, which includes the areas around the capital, Edinburgh. Scotland has over 700 islands, which are divided into 4 groups. St Kilda is the most remote of all the inhabitable Scottish islands, being over 100 miles from the mainland. Almost all the islands surrounding Scotland, no matter how small or remote, were formerly inhabited, as is shown by the archaeological and documentary evidence. In general, only the more accessible and larger islands retain human populations, though these are in some cases very small. Access to several islands in the northern and western groups was made easy in the course of the 20th century by the construction of bridges or causeways installed for strategic reasons during the Second World War. Climate. The climate of Scotland is temperate and oceanic and tends to be very changeable. It is warmed by the Gulf Stream from the Atlantic and such as much warmer than areas on similar latitudes, for example Oslo, Norway. However, temperatures are generally lower than in the rest of the UK. Winter maximums average 6 degrees above zero in the lowlands and summer maximums averaging 18 degrees above zero. In general, the west of Scotland is warmer than the east due to the influence of the Atlantic Ocean currents and the colder surface temperatures of the North Sea. Rainfall varies widely across Scotland. The Western Highlands of Scotland are the wettest, with annual rainfall exceeding 3,500 millimeters. In comparison, much of lowland Scotland receives less than 700 millimeters annually. Heavy snowfall is not common in the lowlands, but becomes more common with altitude. The number of days with snow falling averages about 20 per winter along the coast, but over 80 days over the Grampians, while many coastal areas average fewer than 10 days. Demographics. The population of Scotland is somewhat over 5 million. The highest concentration of population is in the areas surrounding Glasgow, with over 2 million people living in west central Scotland, centred on the Greater Glasgow urban conurbation. Although the Highlands were widely populated in the past, the Highland clearances, a series of forcible evictions followed by continuing immigration since the 18th century, greatly reduced numbers living there. Those that remain live in crofting townships, irregular groupings of subsistence farms of a few acres each. Scotland has the highest proportion of redheads of any country worldwide, with around 13% of the population having naturally red hair. A further 40% of Scots carry the gene which results in red hair. Due to immigration since World War II, Glasgow, Edinburgh and Dundee have significant Asian and Indian populations. Since the enlargement of the European Union, there has been an increased number of people from Central and Eastern Europe moving to Scotland. A few words about religion. The Church of Scotland, also known as the Kirk, is the national church and has a Presbyterian system of church government. It is not subject to state control, nor is it established as the Church of England within England. It was formally recognized as independent of the UK Parliament by the Church of Scotland Act of 1921, settling centuries of dispute between church and state over jurisdiction and spiritual matters. Early Pictish religion in Scotland is presumed to have resembled Celtic polytheism. Remnants of this original spiritually persistent in the Highlands through the phenomenon of second sight and more recently established spiritual communities such as Findhorn. Christianity came to Scotland around the 2nd century and was firmly established by the 6th and the 7th centuries. However, the Scottish Celtic Church had marked some differences from the rest of Western Christendom. Some of these were resolved at the end of the 7th century following St. Columba's withdrawal to Lone. However, it was not until the 11th century that the Scottish Church became an integral part of the Roman Communion. The Scottish Reformation, initiated in 1560 and led by John Knox, was Calvinist, and throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the Church of Scotland maintained the theology and kept a tight control over the morality of much of the population. The Church had a significant influence on the cultural development of Scotland and early modern times, famously exemplified in Eric Liddell's refusal to race at the Olympic Games on Sunday. Other Protestant demonstrations in Scotland include the Free Church of Scotland and offshoot form, the Church of Scotland, adhering to a more conservative style of Calvinism, the Scottish Episcopal Church, which forms part of the Anglican Communion, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Roman Catholicism in Scotland survived the Reformation, especially on islands such as Uist and Barra, despite the suppression of the 16th to the late 18th centuries. Roman Catholicism was strengthened in the west of Scotland during the 19th century by immigration from Ireland. This continued for much of the 20th century, during which significant numbers of Catholics from Italy and Poland also migrated to Scotland. Much of Scotland, particularly the west central belt around Glasgow, has experienced problems caused by sectarianism, particularly football rivalry between the traditional Roman Catholic team, Celtic, and the traditionally Protestant team, Rangers. What else? Scotland. There are also significant Jewish communities, especially in Glasgow. Scotland has a relatively high proportion of persons who regard themselves as belonging to no religion at all. What about education? The education system in Scotland is distinct from the rest of the United Kingdom. The early roots were in the Education Act of 1496, which first introduced compulsory education for the eldest sons of the nobles. Then in 1561, the principle of general public education was set with the establishment of the National Kirk, which set out a national program for spiritual reform, including a school in every parish. Education finally came under the control of the state rather than the church and became compulsory for all children with the implementation of the Education Act of 1872. As a result, for over 200 years, Scotland had a higher percentage of its population educated at primary, secondary and tertiary levels than any other country in Europe. The difference in education have manifested themselves in different ways, but most noticeably in the number of Scots who went on to become leaders in their fields and at the forefront of innovation and discovery, leading to many Scottish inventions during the 18th and the 19th centuries. Children in Scotland sit standard grade exams at the age of 15 or 16, sometimes earlier, for up to 8 subjects, including compulsory exams in English, mathematics, a foreign language, a science subject and a social subject. The school leaving age is 16, after which students may choose to remain at school and study for higher grade and other advanced exams. A small number of students at certain private independent schools may follow the English system, take English General Certificate of Secondary Education and other exams. Scotland has 13 universities, including the 4 ancient universities of Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow and St Andrews, founded during the medieval period. Bachelor's degrees at Scottish universities are bestowed up to 4 years of study, with an opinion option to graduate with an ordinary degree after only 3 years of study, instead of an honours degree. Unlike the rest of the United Kingdom, Scottish students studying at a Scottish university do not have to pay tuition fees. All Scottish universities attract a high percentage of overseas students and have many links with overseas institutions. Cultures. Scots have a reputation for thriftiness, hard work and pride in their traditions. Scots worldwide celebrate a Burns supper on the birthday of national poet Robert Burns, with a bagpipe playing leading the entrance of the traditional meal of haggis. The culture of Scotland is distinct and internationally recognized. However, they have been influenced by that of neighboring England to the extent that Scots felt inferior, led to the phenomenon of Scottish cringe. Scotland has its own unique art scene with both music and literature. The annual Edinburgh International Festival, including its fringe entertainment, is a major cultural event. There are also several Scottish sporting traditions that are unique to the British Isles. The Loch Ness Monster, familiarly known as Nessie, a mysterious and unidentified legendary creature claimed to inhabit Scotland's Loch Ness, as well known throughout the United Kingdom and the world. The Scottish music scene is a significant aspect of Scottish culture, with both traditional and modern influences. A traditional Scottish instrument is the Great Highland Bagpipe, a wind instrument consisting of musical pipes which are fed continuously by a reservoir of air in a bag. Some harp, a fiddle and accordion are also traditional Scottish instruments, the latter two heavily featured in Scottish country dance bands. Scottish literature has included writings in English, Scottish, Gaelic, Scots, Brythonic, French and Latin. Some of the earliest literature known to have been composed in Scotland dates from the 6th century and includes the Godwin written in Brythonic, Old Welsh, and the Elegy for St. Columba by Dylan Forgale written in Middle Irish. Latin was the language of literature as well. French flourished as literary language long before early Scots texts appeared in the 14th century. After the 17th century, Anglicization increased. The poet and songwriter Robert Burns wrote in the Scots language, although much of his writing is also in English and in light Scots dialect, which would have been accessible to a wider audience. The introduction of the movement known as the Celtic tradition at the end of the 19th century brought elements of fantasy and folklore into fashion. J.M. Barrie provides a good example of this mix of modernity and nostalgia. However, this tradition has been viewed as a major stumbling block for Scottish literature, focusing on an idealized pastoral picture of Scottish culture becoming increasingly removed from the reality of life in Scotland. Novelists such as Irvine Welsh, by contrast, have written in a distinctly Scottish English, reflecting the life of contemporary Scottish culture. Sport. Scotland has its own national governing bodies, such as the Scottish Football Association, the second oldest national football association in the world, and the Scottish Rugby Union and its own national sporting competitions. As such, Scotland enjoys independent representation at many international sporting events, such as the FIFA World Cup, the Rugby World Cup, and the Commonwealth Games, although notably not the Olympic Games. Scotland is the home of golf and is well known for its many golf courses, including the Old Course at St Andrews. Other distinctive features of the national sporting culture include the Highland Games, curling and shinty, featured as in a kilt. Languages, this is what is important in our lecture. Since the United Kingdom lacks a codified constitution, there is no official language. However, Scotland has 3 officially recognized languages: English, Scottish Gaelic and Scots. English is the main language and almost all Scots speak Scottish Standard English. During the 20th century, the number of native speakers of Gaelic, a Celtic language similar to Irish, declined from around 5% to just 1% of the population, almost always on a fully bilingual basis with English. Gaelic is mostly spoken in the Western Isles, where the local council uses the Gaelic name Council of the Western Isles. Under the Gaelic Language Act of 2005, which was passed by the Scottish Parliament to provide some basis for a limited range of Gaelic language service provision, English and Gaelic receive equal respect, but do not have equal legal status. Scots and Gaelic were recognized under the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages ratified by the UK in 2001, and the Scottish Executive is committed, based on the UK's undertakings, to provide support for both. The General Register Office for Scotland estimates that 30% of the population are fluent in Scots, a West Germanic sister language to English. A generic Scottish accent is hard to define because there are so many types. But you can learn to speak with a general accent that non-Scottish people would be able to identify Scottish. Most of the Scottish accents that you may hear come from the lowland and midland areas. These are the regions where the more populated cities, such as Edinburgh, Glasgow and Galway, reside.